Welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher. I'm an Assistant Professor of Journalism here at the University of Canberra. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Caroline.
So look, the coronavirus has been dominating attention this week, and yesterday the Prime Minister, he got out ahead of the World Health Organization, anticipating that a pandemic will be declared. So the government activated its emergency plan in relation to health and containment measures. But what about the economic impact? Does the government have a plan to address the economic impact of the coronavirus?
I think it's a lot less certain in terms of the economics about how bad this is going to be and what it can do about it. Now, it was interesting that Scott Morrison said Treasury and the Treasurer are now looking at some limited measures, modest measures, targeted measures, he said. But those measures will be quite difficult to formulate, I think, because so many businesses in so many areas are affected. Supply chains have been disrupted, so importers and exporters are having trouble. For example, getting parts, the importers, and the exporters, especially of small products that go in planes. Well, of course, there are not so many planes these days. And then we've had the big hits on the tourism sector, on the education sector. Now, it has been notable that the government and some backbenchers have been making the point that the universities are quite liquid and therefore have the capacity to absorb the shock of the virus, but in other areas I think the government might be somewhat more sympathetic. And we should also note that the government has now extended the travel ban on foreigners coming from China for at least another week, so university students are in limbo once more.
I think it would be news to universities that they are as liquid perhaps as the government might perceive them to be. But this is though also, I mean, I've noticed a bit of a loosening of the talk around the surplus as well in response to this. So this is, you know, the government seems to be repositioning itself around whether or not a surplus is deliverable.
Yes, I think it is, and it's softening up people for the back in black line to become not just a storyline but now possibly a fairy tale. And of course the government at the budget time really boasted about that. You could actually get a mug from the Liberal Party to have your coffee in that said back in black. Well, it's saying now we really don't know. However, I do think despite all this the government will be looking for ways to try and not have a deficit when the figures come out, and so there'll be a search for counting tricks, hollow logs, all sorts of things. It may or may not be able to pull a surplus off despite everything, but it's certainly looking a lot less likely than in that sort of halcyon days pre-election.
Okay, so you know, that seems to be that there's a little bit of pressure around the government following Labor's announcement of the net zero emissions target. Do you think that the government is going to come under increasing pressure around this, seeing they're a bit reluctant to go there?
I think it's under great pressure and will be under even more pressure as the big climate conference in Glasgow approaches late in the year. The government, of course, has attacked Anthony Albanese, said he has no plan to get there, but the point is being made from those around Scott Morrison that he's not so much attacking the target, but the lack of a pathway there. So I think that what he is doing is keeping open the possibility, and it's probably no more than a possibility, that at some stage he could say, well, we have devised a plan and we can get to that target by 2050, but at the moment it's very unclear whether he would want to take that line or could take it, because the big stumbling block would be the Nationals. And of course, they are ferociously against a 2050 target, and their internal situation is so unstable that if the government decided, or Morrison decided, he wanted to adopt that target, then it could just sort of blow up in the Nationals Party.
Yes, indeed. So instead we've got the climate technology roadmap coming from the government, and that will soon be unveiled. Do you think this is going to satisfy the critics who claim that the government, should be doing more on climate change?
No, I don't think it will satisfy them. I think that probably it will be welcomed by those in this debate, or at least some of them. Business, you would expect, would think that this is a good step, but I think that the opinion will be that really more needs to be done.
But surely, the answers do lie in technology.
Well, they do, but it's whether that technology map and the incentives and so on are adequate.
Okay. Another issue to emerge this week, it's been a busy week, foreign interference. In a speech on Monday, the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, said that Australia is subject to a lot of foreign interference, but he was careful not to name China. And he said that there were more spies operating in Australia today than there were during the height of the Cold War. And he also made reference to a rise in domestic right-wing groups. How well placed is Australia to deal with these issues?
Well, the first thing we might say is that this was a very comprehensive speech, and usually, of course, ASIO tends to be in the shadows,
yes.
Although in recent years, to be fair, it's come out much more, and its directors have been a lot more open. But nevertheless, this was a very broad and frank address. Now, in terms of how well we're placed to deal with it, of course, we now have the foreign interference legislation, and I do think that that has increased the armoury to deal with that issue. As you mentioned, Mike Burgess was very diplomatic and didn't mention China, but of course China is seen to be very active in the foreign interference sphere. Now, the reference to right-wing groups was notable and seen as quite important, because the previous attention has been much more, of course, on Islamic extremism, and Mike Burgess did make the point that that was still the major source of fears about terrorist incidents. But the fact that he went out of his way to point to these right-wing groups, saying they were around in, the lounge rooms of the suburbs, essentially producing their hate ideology, or sharing their hate ideology, and looking at weapons and so on, I think is quite a wake-up call. And whether we're as prepared to deal with that as with other forms of terrorism or foreign interference is probably more questionable. But of course, we are seeing the rise of these sorts of groups in various countries, so it is a danger for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's seen as an important correction, perhaps, and particularly following Christchurch. We've got Jacinda Ardern in Australia, so it's important that he's made that point.
Yes.
Yeah. So another sensitive issue, and lastly, the Senate passed a motion calling on the Council for the Order of Australia to strip Bettina Arndt of her award, following the statements that she made about the death of Hannah Clark and her kids. Do you think that this is putting the council in an awkward position, calling for the withdrawal of her award?
I think it's putting it in a very awkward position. Now, a number of people have been stripped of awards, but that's when they've committed crimes, been convicted of crimes, and that's in the guidelines for the awards, so that's pretty clear cut. Yeah. Doesn't involve a lot of discretion, obviously. But when someone has been making unacceptable statements, that is really much more of a grey area, I think. It raises questions of freedom of speech. It raises the issue of setting a precedent, whether one comment is beyond the pale and the person is stripped of the award, but another one, which is also unacceptable, is is not judged not so bad. I don't know how the council will go on this, but I'm sure it's a decision it would prefer not to have to make.
Indeed, I'm glad I'm not having to make that decision, I've got to say. Look, thanks so much, Michelle. Look forward to speaking to you again next week.
Thanks, Caroline.